So good afternoon, everybody. I would like to talk about why the management of personal big data should be decentralized and how to implement their mechanism to support this decentralized management, and also how to use the system. Well, the discussion evolves around B2C services and how to use personal data in there. B2C services are primarily to provide values to individual consumers. So the primary beneficiary of B2C services are individuals, customers, ourselves. So service providers become secondary beneficiaries by winning or surviving the competition for that value, which is a major cause of innovation. So this structure is quite important for the sake of industry development. And also the primary beneficiaries of data sharing among the vendors are also individuals as well. So individual control over circulation of their own data, personal data, is quite important to the value of B2C services. On the other hand, if others, like vendors, own and manages your data, then that would impair value creation in B2C services. So this compares the two situations, the current situation and the future situation we'd like to develop. On the left-hand side is the current situation where vendors manage their customers' data. So the customers, we don't have our own data at hand, so that we cannot utilize our own data. That's one problem. And there are other problems on the side of vendors as well. So the vendors face the cost and risk of managing big personal data. In fact, there are so many incidents happening concerning data leakage, information leakage at one time. And another issue here is that the vendors do not know consumers' needs quite well, because the data easily available to them is the data originating from the services they themselves provide, rather than the data from other sources like the services by other vendors are not quite easily available to the vendors. So that's why they don't know our needs, the customers' needs quite well. So there are so many problems arising from centralized management of personal data. So let's change the situation by adding another system of data management that's decentralized management of personal data by the data subjects ourselves, the individuals. So if that is added to the current management system, then there would be many nice things arising from that system. So first of all, we would be able to enjoy services and interactions among ourselves by sharing our data with ourselves and with the vendors and governments and so on and so forth. And on the side of the vendors, there are many good things as well. So the vendors do not face very severe risk or cost for managing big personal data, because the data is originally or primarily managed by the data subjects, the individual. The vendors, do not have to store a huge amount of personal data on a daily basis. They can access their customers, and the customers may be able to provide their data to the vendors temporarily. And if the vendor uses the data by analyzing the data to obtain some statistical analysis result, then after that, the vendor can just erase the data from the database at hand, because the data stays at the side of the data subjects, individuals, or the customers. So that's why the vendors can avoid too severe risk or cost of managing personal data. And secondly, as I said very lightly right now, the vendors would be able to know the customers' needs much better than the situation before, because they can access their customers to obtain more detailed and more comprehensive personal data from the customers. So let's implement it by what we call PDS. So PDS is a tool, a system to implement that sort of decentralized data management of personal data. So the PDS allows each individual to accumulate and manage her own data and to utilize the data by sharing it with other parties like your family members, your friends, and the vendors and governments and so on. This concept is not new at all. It dates back to more than 45 years ago. The novelist Hoshi Shinichi wrote this novel, VoiceNet, which is a rather long one compared with the other so-called short by him. It was written 46 years ago. And this novel talks about some kind of dystopia where there are many business operators called the information bank. Information banks ask the customer about their personal data, personal secrets, like what they did with whom and how and so on and so forth, by phone line, by making phone call to their customers, because those days there was no personal computer or smartphones and so on and so forth. So it's a phone-based survey of the secret data of the customers. But anyway, in that way, the information banks accumulate their customers' personal data in a computer system. So there are many information banks, and each of them have some computers. But someday, those computers across many information banks communicate with each other and form a huge network of many computers. And this computer network forms some kind of intelligence and tries to control the society by controlling people. Because those computers have many pieces of secrets of many customers, many people. The computers can threat those people based upon those secrets. So they would be able to control engineers to manipulate phone machines so that your telephone call may be tapped all times in such a way that the computers will be able to know who may be aware of this hidden regime of computers. And so that the computers will be able to exclude from society those possible rebellions. So that's what this dystopia, VoiceNet, talks about. So that's a very bad implementation of PDS, which is centralized PDS rather than decentralized PDS, because the whole system, this information bank system, the computer network is, in a sense, centralized control, centrally controlled by this network of computer, rather than each individual persons. So we must be careful that PDS may be centralized or decentralized. There are actually centralized PDS operatives so far, like Kaiser Permanente EHR. EHR stands for Electronic Health Record, which is basically to make a collaboration among medical vendors, hospitals, and clinics to share patients' information among these organizations. And PHR stands for Personal Health Record, and typical PHRs would include Google Health, which is not operative right now, and also Microsoft Health Vault. So these PHRs are, in a sense, PDS, Personal Data Service, Personal Data Store, but they are centralized. They are based on centralized control by Google or Microsoft. So, for instance, the patient, you cannot extract your data from Health Vault. that's for the sake of enclosure of the customers by Microsoft, of course. And there are many other types of centralized PDS right now around. On the other hand, decentralized PDS are very few, like PLR that I'm going to talk about in the rest of the talk. And also MIT has developed what they call open PDS, and Stanford has another one as well. And there are other few attempts to establish PDS services around the world, in particular in Europe, including France and Britain. The difference between them, between centralized PDS and decentralized PDS, would be these two. One is the centralized PDS. In a centralized PDS, data management depends on some particular vendor. So for instance, in the case of MS Health Vault, data management is basically up to Microsoft rather than you. And second, it is hard to, centralized PDS is difficult to cooperate with other vendors. So for instance, Microsoft Health Vault has difficulty in collaborating with Google Health, quite naturally. On the other hand, decentralized PDS, data management is fully up to the data subject, individuals, rather than any particular vendor. Also, it is easy for decentralized PDS to cooperate with vendors, so that mediation among different vendors is possible to make it possible to indirectly cooperate among the vendors. So in a nutshell, in a picture, it would be looking like this. PLR stands for Personal Life Repository. It is kind of decentralized PDS, and it has many nice aspects of decentralized PDS. So each individual, by using PLR, manages her own data and shares the data with others, relying on no particular vendor at all. It's totally up to you to manage your own data. And on the other hand, no single centralized service, which is depicted as green circles here, can or should manage all the personal data. Sorry, one word is missing here. So there are so many centralized services, like Google operates one, and Yahoo, Microsoft, Facebook, Culture Convenience Club, and also the My Number system of Japanese government is another centralized service. So these guys are trying to, except for My Number system, these guys are trying to extend their services by incorporating many other services and many customers. However, it's of course impossible for any of them to cover the entire world, right? And then a problem arises on how to coordinate data distributed in different centralized services. So maybe you want to integrate data from Google and another piece of data from Culture Convenience Club or Japanese government to apply some statistical analysis and so on. But that is impossible in the current situation because, for instance, Google and Japanese government never give data to each other, right? In order to access all these data and integrate them, it's up to you. You must use some tool to extract data from these different centralized services and integrate the data at hand using some kind of decentralized PDS like PLR. So that's why decentralized PDS is necessary, and PLR is one of them. So this is the architecture of PLR, Personal Life Repository. It's very simple. So each user, like you and your friend, would have some personal device like personal computer or smartphone. And you are going to install some applications like PLL server and some kind of PLL applications as well. So PLL server, although it is called server, it is a smartphone application or PC application. It operates in your hand. So you store your personal data in PLL server and also in some cloud. And PLL cloud consists of several different so-called public cloud storage, like Google Drive, OneDrive, Dropbox, iCloud, and Bitcasa, and so on. So these services provide you with basically free storage services. For instance, Google Drive provides you 15 gigabytes for free. So there are many of them. You're going to use them as they are and store your data, not only in your personal device, but also in these clouds. However, the data are encrypted in both your personal device and also in the cloud. And the important point here is that the key for decrypting the data is not disclosed to the operator of these cloud services. So Google and Dropbox never get to know the key, so that they don't know the content of the personal data of yours stored in the cloud. And you use the cloud in order to share the data with your friend, your family member, and some business operators. And all these housekeeping work like decryption, encryption, and communication with the server, with the cloud, is handled by PLL server. And these applications can be easily developed based upon the functionality of PLL server. So that's the architecture of personal life repository. So there are several frequently asked questions about PLL, and many of them concern the usability of this system. So people would ask, it may be quite difficult for ordinary people to use PLL and manage their own data. The answer is no. For instance, once data sharing is configured, after that, your data is automatically shared and utilized by the specified parties without your intervention. So for instance, if you initially set up, configure the data sharing in PLL, like you would be able to set up the configuration here so that this hospital and this clinic can access your PLL cloud, so that the data originating from the hospital would be automatically stored in your cloud, and that data would be referred to by the clinic and vice versa. The clinic's data may be stored here, and that data will be extracted by the hospital and used there. So that setting may be done initially, maybe by yourself or by your family member. If you're not able to manipulate your personal computer or smartphone very well, then you can ask your friends or children or grandchildren to configure your PLL in that way. And after that, you don't have to do anything. You lead your daily life as usual. You don't have to touch your smartphone. You don't even own any personal device at all, because the setup is done here beforehand. So that's the first point, why PLL is easy to use. Or even you don't have to use PLL at all. And secondly, PLL apps prevent inadvertent information leakage. You may worry about the risk of leaking your information by your fault. But PLL applications could be made in such a way that it's quite difficult for you to inadvertently leak your information. That's the second point. The third point, it is also possible that PLL applications to prevent inappropriate data sharing. So it would be in such a way that it's quite hard to make PLL applications disclose data irrelevant to services. So for instance, if you remember how you use Facebook, for instance, there are many games and related services associated with Facebook, and some of these services require many pieces of your personal data, but in some cases, some of these pieces of information is not useful for the data to be provided. And those pieces of data are irrelevant to the services, so PLL apps will be able to prevent the disclosure of these data that is relevant to the services. So it's quite safe to use PLL. And finally, you don't have to perfectly manage your data using PLL. It would be very, very hard. Your life would be filled up with your very detailed management of data if you have to manage every inch of the usage of any piece of your personal data all the time. So, of course, you can delegate the management of your personal data to others, like mediators that I'm going to talk about later. Because it's always impossible to perfectly control your data very detailed, in a very detailed fashion. You just declare that, okay, I'm going to control this part of my personal data about this kind of services, but I'd like to delegate the rest of the management to somebody else. And that should be possible and technically feasible as well. Okay, so far we have talked about the technical aspects of data management, but here we would be talking about the social or cultural aspect of decentralized data management. So PDS or PLL, like decentralized PDS, would allow each individual to manage her own data on her own responsibility and authority. That is to freely share any part of the data with any others. And of course, vendors are not responsible for this management by their customers at all. And this way of data management or data usage of personal data is perfectly compliant with all regulations on personal data in any parts of the world, including Personal Information Protection Act of Japan and guidelines on medical data management. That's also in Japan, and EU Data Protection Act, and there are other regulations in other countries as well. And all these regulations match with the data management done by decentralized PDS. I'd like to talk about the environment of personal data management. First, there are some recent trend of domestic regulations and government policies. First of all, revised Personal Information Protection Law and revised My Number Law went through the Diet last year, and they will be enforced quite soon. Actually, My Number is already operative right now in Japan. And second, new law to promote utilization of medical and other personal data under individual self-information control will be submitted to the Diet and pass the Diet this year, towards the end of this year. And third one is that Ministry of Health, Labor and Welfare, Korosho, is advancing institutional reforms of medical care provision, which is to be complete in 9 years later, 2025. And due to this reform, the data sharing, medical data sharing, and nursery care data sharing will be mandatory among medical care services and also nursery care services. And in particular, the simultaneous revision of medical and nursing care fees 2 years later will highlight the necessity for medical and nursing care vendors to share their clients' data with each other. I'm going to talk about this a bit later in more detail. That's the domestic situation. And the situation in the whole globe, or in particular Europe, is important as well. The European Parliament will pass new data protection rules in this year as well. And in particular, the important in these rules is twofold. One is Article number 17, which concerns right to erasure, or which used to be called right to be forgotten. And another one is Article number 18, which concerns data portability. Right to erasure is your right to be able to erase your data online. So, for instance, there was a Google Spanish case 2 years ago, May 2014. A Spaniard went into some economic difficulty, and his house was in auction in 1998. And this incident was covered by some local newspaper. However, it's long time ago, 17 years ago. No, more than that, more than 17 years ago. Even it is so old story, even currently, if you search the Google search engine, this particular person's name, then the result will be about this newspaper article about this auction about his possible selling her house many years ago, which is quite inappropriate for him currently, because his economic condition right now is quite well, unlike before. So that would cause very inadequate difficulty in his current life, in his current business. So he demanded Google to erase this search result from the search engine operation. And the court judgment about this was positive to this Spanish guy. So the European Court of Justice demanded Google to erase this search result, and Google accepted. That's the Google Spanish case, and which is, very advanced application of this Article 17 to the actual case. And so this particular article will survive in the final rule to be passed in European Commission this year. And another one is Article 18, which is data portability, which means your data is portable from one vendor to another. So if your data is stored in some database operated by some vendor, then you can demand the vendor to extract that data, to transfer the data to another vendor's database for you to enjoy some services from this new vendor, and so on. And that's mandated by this article. So that's one thing. And second one is also Europe. European Commission and the United States have agreed on a new framework for transatlantic data flows that is called the EU-US Privacy Shield this February. Well, this is less than 9 days ago. And this contains three main points. One is strong obligations on companies handling Europeans' personal data and robust enforcement of the obligations. And second is clear safeguards and transparency obligations on United States government, in particular National Security Agency. So US government access to personal data must be under some clear safeguard. And the third one is effective protection of EU citizens' rights with several responsibilities, like compensations. So this is, in particular, European situation. And although Europe is one part of the world, the rest of the world must be doing business in Europe as well, including Japan. So not just European companies, but also American companies and Japanese companies and companies in any other part of the world must be compliant with these regulations and rules in order to carry out any business in Europe or any business related to Europe or any business using European citizens' personal data. So for instance, if a Japanese company has some branch in Europe, then they hire some employees there, then they would be forced to handle some personal data of these employees. And in order to do that, maybe they may want to transfer the data into the server in Japan, but that is regulated very severely. In order to be able to do that, this Japanese company must pass very severe restrictions and regulations and conditions and so on and so forth. So in order to Japanese vendors to do or keep doing businesses in Europe and in any other parts of the world which has similar regulations like Europe, these companies must have some system to guarantee individuals, including employees and customers, self-information control. So this is not just Europe, but also the entire world. And another issue is the relevance to artificial intelligence, because AI uses a lot of data. And most of the part of these data are personal data. Of course, some part of data are public, open data, but much of that data is quite personal. Artificial intelligence is in third boom, like deep learning, IBM Watson, self-driving cars, robots, and marketing analysis, and so on. So there are so many new technologies and possible applications of AI. And people are investing a lot to develop new algorithms and software and so on. But what they are not quite aware of is the severe fact that more than 90% of development cost for AI is due to data acquisition and structuration rather than developing algorithms or developing software. More than 90% concerns data. So circulation of detailed personal data is quite important in order for AI to provide high-quality B2C services. And B2C services accounts for more than 60% of the entire GDP of the world, right? And PLR, or decentralized PDS, realizes such circulation of structured and detailed personal data. So what I'm talking about here is quite important for AI to spread and revolutionize the industry. Well, I'm going to go into the detail in the latter half of the lecture, but this is a summary of what kind of application would be possible with using PLR. So the applications would encompass energy management and healthcare, learning and education, asset management, marketing. All these are sort of autonomous, distributed, and collaborative services. And I think this is the end of the former half of the lecture. Any questions or comments? Oh, by the way, you may interrupt at any time of my talk. And right now as well, of course. Any comments, questions, complaints? Okay, we have some rest for how many minutes? I don't know.